a nice ominous voice, which comes with the clicking of recording. And welcome to Yelling at Concrete podcast, Amy.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Very welcome. Happy you could join us. I think I contacted you quite a while back to say.
Yeah. Then I got COVID and I went AWOL for a little bit.
I mean, that will take you out, I'm told.
A little bit.
It's not quite the cold we expected it to be.
No, it's not.
But you're better now, right?
Yeah. I'm functioning. Functioning's a good word to describe it.
Back in the world of the living.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I'm terrible at introducing people, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself. If you could tell the people who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so my name's Amy. I write a blog about Shropshire history, Shropshire folklore, and anything that's a bit weird and wonderful that happens in Shropshire and then the wider kind of area. I am interested in folklore of Britain in general, but coming from Shropshire, I kind of am very interested in the weird and wonderful that we have to offer.
No, that makes sense. We do have some American listeners, so can you tell them where Shropshire is? Because I doubt they know.
Yeah, most people in England don't even know. So Shropshire is between Wales. You've got Wales on one side, and then you've got like Birmingham and the Greater Midlands on the other side. So we're kind of a border county. We're quite far from London. So that's kind of a general, but we are in pretty much the middle of the country. Neither south nor north, kind of.
Birmingham is Black Country, right?
Yeah. We're on the part of Shropshire I grew up in is the outskirts of the Black Country. So it's quite, for a countryside area, it's quite industrial. So we do have like that Black Country influence. If you go further down into Shropshire, it's more like the Blue Remembered Hills and kind of all, I likes a good hanging eye does, that kind of thing. But we do have quite a lot of Welsh influence because in like the medieval period in particular, we couldn't stop having wars with the Welsh, and they happen to be in Shropshire, a lot of them.
Right,
so it's quite cool.
That's fair. Yeah, no, I think we run that curse of being English of when you mention England to people who aren't from England. You say, "Oh yeah, I'm from here," and if it's not London, their faces just go blank.
Yeah,
I have no idea what that is. Yeah.
The best I ever had was at university. Because I went to university in the northwest and I've kind of just stayed up here. And so I said, "Oh, I'm from Shropshire," and they looked at me and they went, "Oh yeah, that's in Scotland, isn't it?" And I'm kind of, for a start, I was like, "Do I sound Scottish?" Like I had more of an accent back then, so it was kind of like, "No, it's not."
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm on literally the opposite coast to you because I'm in Lincolnshire.
Yeah.
So again, and I'm originally from Scunthorpe, so that's like North Lincolnshire. It's not even like proper Lincolnshire because Lincolnshire rejected that part of the nation. Nobody wanted Scunthorpe, so it was just get rid of that. And you try and delve into it, and you're like, "Yeah, no, I'm just gonna say I'm from Lincoln."
I'm just gonna
keep it default.
Be fine.
People. But no. I mean, I was reading. I did a look because like you say, like a lot of people don't know where Shropshire is. I did look it up to confirm in my head where it was.
Yeah.
Because I'm terrible at geography anyway. And my knowledge of the west coast of England is very slim.
Yeah.
It's like Blackpool and Liverpool and Manchester, and that's pretty much
it's till Cornwall, there's nothing else.
Yeah. But you're kind of like slap bang in the middle of like a crossover point.
Yeah, and quite traditionally, even going back as far as the Romans, people tend to go through Shropshire and not really spend much time there. So even the Roman time, the old Roman road that went from Holyhead in Wales all the way down to London just kind of went through Shropshire. And I think we've suffered from that stereotype ever since, is the idea that it's somewhere you might go through to get to Wales, or you might go through, if you're Welsh, to get to England. And there's actually like such a lot of history and stuff actually happening there. And I think that's one of the things that delved me into doing my blog in lockdown, was kind of the idea of, I knew I wanted to write, and I knew I wanted to write about history, but kind of like the weirder kind of, because I'm an ex-goth, so it was naturally, that was what I was drawn to. And then I was like, oh wait, no, let's talk about some of the things that happen in Shropshire. There's a few weird stuff, and some of it's a bit metal and a bit cool, and then it snowballed from there, really.
You be an ex-goth?
I don't think I say that, but put a bit of Bauhaus on, and I'm just as bad.
It's one of those things, like, as soon as you punch the card to be like, yeah, I'm part of goth, you can't get out. Like,
no, it's part-time, I think now. I like comfy clothes slightly too much, but give me the opportunity. Around Halloween, I'm in the graveyard.
Casual goth.
Yeah. Cozy goth.
Yeah, like when you get bikers who are super into bikes, and then they're like weekend riders.
Yeah.
Still own the coat. I just don't throw it on every day because
I'm in my 40s and got two kids or something. Yeah.
I mean, this is a segue completely, but I mean, presumably you heard about Anne Rice passing away today. Yeah. And I was saying to a friend of mine who's super into literature, I assumed Anne Rice had passed on years ago.
Yeah, to be honest, I read her in my teens. I read her really before I'd read anything gothic, vampire literature. I hadn't quite got the idea of reading Dracula yet, but I'd seen all the Hammer horror films, and I read Anne Rice, and I was kind of like probably a little bit too young to really be reading some of it, and it definitely made an impact on me. But I thought she'd passed away years ago, to be honest. But it is sad, and it's nice to see how much of an impact on the wider, not just the people you'd expect to have read her and to have been influenced by her, but like the wider world sort of thing.
Yeah, I think she was definitely one of those writers who, I mean, every teenage goth reads Anne Rice and watches an interview with Vampire, because that influences you hugely.
Yeah.
But it always surprises me the amount of people who aren't into gothic subculture or anything like that. I'm just like, yeah, no, I've read Anne Rice.
Yeah, I enjoyed that. Yeah. It's definitely a conversation starter, isn't it? It's definitely
it piques that interest. But those are books with a long history of looking at the mythos of various different regions. With her being from New Orleans and diving into that. But you've studied history, right?
Yes, I did my degree in history. That was many moons ago. So I've always been interested in kind of social history as a wider thing, and kind of people fascinate me. And I think that's, again, molds well with the folklore, is that you've got it's almost like the hidden history, the kind of, there's all this stuff going on, but then we're actually still doing this. And I like that about folklore. But I was very into medieval history, but like your paganism, your Vikings, your Anglo-Saxons, anything that kind of was like early pre-1066 was kind of my jam.
Yeah. I mean, you're the second person I know who's studied the historical subject and has been on the podcast for 2022.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Spoke to, oh my God, the name escapes me, but she did Gothic literature, of the 19th century Gothic literature.
Yeah, that's cool.
I asked her the question of why getting into history? Why not just dive straight into, the mythos of it all? Why go to the facts?
I think for me, it's that connection to the people and to the stories. I think I've probably always been interested in folklore and mythology and that kind of thing before I even really knew what it was. Because I grew up in a family that was very interested in the stories of my area. I tell this story often, but my granddad believed that he met the devil in Ironbridge churchyard. He was playing cards one Sunday when he should have been in church, and the devil came and gave him a big telling off and told him that if he carried on, he would be seeing a lot more of the devil. And my granddad never picked up a pack of cards again. And if he saw us doing anything game related on a Sunday, even when like Xbox and things like that were a thing, he would be like, no, you can't do that, the devil will get you. And then he'd tell us this cautionary story, and in reality it was probably just an adult that looked a bit kind of scary. But that idea of these like stories that almost become official history was very much in my earlier life. And I'm very fortunate as well. In Shropshire we have an abundance of kind of medieval ruins, and just down the road from me we had the Iron Bridge, which I've never been interested in industrial history really, but it's the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So I grew up in an area that was very saturated with history. So I think naturally I was more drawn to it. And things like I'm a big Lord of the Rings fan. That naturally piqued my curiosity for like Anglo-Saxon history and things like that. So I think my influences, my area, my interest in literature and fantasy inevitably drew me to study history. And I had a really cool history teacher called Ralph that was just, he was cool.
I like that. Yeah. Though you have now just like triggered a memory in my head of my other history teachers and how boring they were.
Yeah. Oh, Ralph was, he was about 5'5", bless him. And he was just really cool. He was just, he knew about everything. And the way he taught history, it was like really interesting. So I think it's always kind of interested me. And I was just like, no, I want to study that.
Yeah. I find it interesting how people kind of get into subjects. I mean, like you know, I've had a vested interest in kind of stories and storytelling, as it were, and like yourself into the fantasy side of it and looking at those things. But I never went down the route of looking up local. You know, like Lincolnshire, North Lincolnshire has quite deep folklore, and it just never occurred to me. It never even kind of picked up because my viewpoint was looking at stories and going, well, I could make stories.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I think, to be honest, it was quite subconscious for me. Like, I didn't necessarily set out to write about Shropshire, because I left Shropshire at 18, went to university, and then I've never really gone back. I've never lived in Shropshire since I was 18, 19. But during the lockdown, I'd kind of set myself a little challenge. I'm going to start writing again, because life had gotten, you know, you have these dreams when you're a teenager, and then you end up doing everything but that. And I was like, what are cool stories? And one of the first blog posts I wrote about was the sin eaters in Shropshire. And the sin eating is like an overall tradition. There's arguments how much it actually happened. I tend to believe that it probably did happen a fair bit more than we realise in rural communities. But because it was outlawed by the Catholic Church and then later on the Church of England, if you were seen to be doing it, it was a sin, and you'd have ended up like getting the full force of the law behind it. So I knew that we had a tradition of sin eating in Shropshire through things I'd read and different literature I'd read. So I really explored that. In particular, a chap called Richard Munslow, who was the last sin eater. So sin eating is this ritual where you tend to, if you've died without having the proper last rites, somebody will come into the house where the body's laid out, and they'll have like a ritual meal over your body. So it's usually bread and wine, and they say little prayers, and the food is meant to take on the sin. So the person eating the food is taking all of the sins of that person who's deceased. So then they can have a proper Christian burial and everything's fine and dandy, and it stops ghosts coming into the community. But that sin eater has to carry those sins forever. So they tend to accumulate them over their life. And unfortunately, there's no sin eater for the sin eater. So when they pass away, they're kind of forsaking their place in heaven or whatever, in order to, you know, have this thing in the community and to do this duty in the community. And traditionally, sin eaters tend to be paupers or people that may have had mental health problems or people that were destitute and down and out. However, Richard Munslow was a wealthy farmer of quite a well-off area of Shropshire, and he resurrected the practice. And that's one of the reasons why I think the practice was probably more well known about in the past than what we know about it now. It's because he would have had to have known about this practice in order to resurrect it. And he actually lost 3 of his children. They all died within 2 weeks of each other, and that drove him to become a sin eater. And he eventually obviously passed himself, but he didn't do it for money or for food or for any of the reasons why the more traditional ones would do. He did it just because he wanted to probably find a way to deal with his own grief. And I'd known of that story prior to writing the blog, and that was the first one I explored, and I found that people were interested in it and interested about Shropshire, because a lot, like we've said, a lot of people are kind of like, well, where is this place? Is it near Bag End? Is it, you know, that it's got this almost quasi-mythological idea because no one's heard of it. And I found myself turning back to Shropshire a lot more when I sat to write. Like, I did write about Vikings and more kind of straightforward history things. But then I kept having ideas about Shropshire and I kept exploring it. And I think it was my way of reconnecting with my home as well, and reconnecting with where I'd grown up and my experiences. And then it kind of just snowballed, and now it's all I talk about.
I do like the idea of like Shropshire not being necessarily part of the UK though, and maybe you have to go through like a portal to get there. You have to pass through Birmingham to just, like, access
Birmingham's
it.
a portal in itself, isn't it? Bless it. It was civilization for me growing up, Birmingham, which it says a lot.
I mean, everyone has a place like that. I think for us, we used to go to Doncaster, and that was the biggest thing in the world. You go to a major city when you live in a small town. It's
oh, one more step, Mr. Frodo.
Yeah, it's fantastic. You just remind me, I've actually seen a film about Cineing. The Order, I think it's got Heath Ledger in it.
I've not seen that. Yeah,
and that tracks like the horror of kind of Cineing. But I was reading your one of your posts before about monks and knights and accepting their sins, and something which I'd never heard of. Literally,
that's cool.
And I thought that was really interesting of people passing on their burden.
I think it was mutually beneficial for both people in the medieval period. Is the knights could go and do terrible things in the name of Christianity and the country, and the monks could make an awful lot of money by going, oh yes, we'll pray for you, we'll take on those sins. And I think the more you look into things like sin eating, there's probably variations of the practice in all societies and cultures. Like I was talking to somebody briefly not long after I published that, and they said that in the Appalachians there's actually sin eating is a folklore and a piece of folklore in the Appalachians, and that's 1,000,000 miles away from Shropshire. Like it's so far removed from the area and things, so it shows that these things can be universal. And I think that's one of the great things about folklore that you don't necessarily get in history, because traditional history tends to be, oh, this is the fact, and in 1842, and in folklore I can tell the same story as somebody else, but it will mean something different to me, and it will resonate differently with me, and it will also be told differently, and that doesn't matter. That enhances the quality of it, and I really like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think when folklore is involved or myth and legend, it increases the engagement factor of things and makes them more memorable as well.
Yeah, I definitely think so, and I think it also adds life to an area, especially with rural communities and small communities. Like some of the I write a lot about ghost stories and kind of general paranormal weirdness.
Yeah.
And some of the smallest areas, like there's a place called East Hope, which is on Wenlock Edge, and it's a tiny little village. It's one that you could quite easily go through and not really pay much attention, but there's an old church. But some of the ghost stories there show you how much life has actually been lived there. And it's the home to one of my favorite hauntings. It's got two big burly monks that like to punch each other and fight. Still, they absolutely hated each other in life, but they were both sent from the local monastery to collect the taxes.
Right.
So they were kind of like, right, okay, we can squirrel a bit of the taxes away and put up with each other. And what they'd do is they'd go collect the taxes, get really, really drunk and enjoy all the pleasures of being outside of a monastery, and then go back and pretend that none of that had happened, but not really communicate with each other other than having the odd argument. And then the one time the taxation was more, for some reason, there was more taxes being collected and these monks were sent. They had an argument on the way, but it was more to do with who was going to pocket the extra money.
Right.
They got there, got all the taxes, got really, really drunk, had a big argument, which resulted in a punch up. They had this massive fight, rolled down a flight of stairs together, still paggering each other. And then they both knocked their little noodles in and ended up dying at the same time. And they still enact that to this day. They can be seen in the churchyard just beating the seven bells out of each other. And I think you get stories like that in the smallest communities. It doesn't matter whether there's ghosts and apparitions and that's an actual thing, but the story itself is beautiful, and that kind of originality you don't really see elsewhere in your bigger kind of areas. And I just love it, because I literally described in some of the, I've read accounts from like the 1800s, and they're burly monks, and you never think of burly monks. I know you get like Friar Tuck being a bit like short and chubby, but you have like Ragnar Lodbrok types. Like, I just think it's brilliant.
A really hench monk. There's something threatening about a hench monk.
There isn't there? Yeah, like Dolph Lundgren-esque kind of.
Like you can turn down like someone who's timid and just like, you should consider Christ and all this, because when someone comes and towers over you, like, oh, I don't know, maybe I do need to consider Christ.
Christ gets you swole. So I love that story. And like I said, it's such a small area, but you would like, there's another one. One of the weirdest ghosts I've ever come across is there's a little village called Hodnet, and Hodnet, again, there's not much there. It's lovely, it's picturesque, but there isn't much, and it's little country lanes winding to get to the centre. And there was a farmer that lived on the outskirts of Hodnet, and he had a really unremarkable life. He didn't do anything above what most people do. He was a good farmer and he was nice and just kind of lived his life until he died. And for some reason he haunts the area still, but not in his own form, as a man with a horse's head.
Okay.
And there's no reason why he would. But he's been seen, even, I think the last reports I read were from like the early 2000s of this chap just wandering with a horse's head. And I like to think that like maybe he'd gone to wherever we go afterwards, and the guy at the pearly gate or whatever was like, oh no, sir, you're not quite good enough to come to heaven, but you can choose your form. You can be like the sexiest man, you can be whatever you want. And he looked at him and was like, oh, can you give me a horse's head? That's it's just bizarre. And
I think there's a beauty to that. I mean, I think that kind of brings us to a good point to ask. Obviously the way you talk about folklore and the way you talk about mythology and all those kinds of things, do you see yourself as kind of a believer of these things? I'm probably one of those where I believe, but I'm like a skeptic. So I'm naturally, you could point at a tree outside and go, that's a god, Amy, worship it, and I'd go, oh, that's cool, I'll go and have a look. I certainly think that there are experiences that are out of the ordinary and that can be deemed as paranormal. I've had a few experiences myself that I couldn't explain away. Like when I was a child, I used to have terrible nightmares when I was a child, and then my brother was born and it was made worse. But I used to have terrible nightmares, and my mum and dad ended up having the landing light on and me sleeping with the door open. And then it must have been when I was about 5 or 6. I was old enough to remember. There used to be this figure stood in my doorway, and he was in full, like what I would now know as World War II army regalia, dark hair parted in like an old-fashioned kind of way, and he was always smiling. Whenever he was there, he was always smiling, and through seeing him, I was able to sleep soundly. And I did have a vivid imagination when I was a kid. I was always looking for fairies and goblins and stuff. But years later, when my nan, a Welsh nan, ended up going into a care home, we were clearing out her stuff, and I found this picture, and I said to my dad, who is this? Like, when the hairs on the back of your arm and neck stand up. And he said, oh, that's your granddad. Now, my Welsh granddad died before I was born. And he always said to my dad that he would be able to, he'd see his grandchildren and my dad's children. And the chap that I was looking at was the same fella that was stood in my doorway. And after he'd passed, my nan boxed everything up and put it away because she couldn't have anything that reminded her of her husband. And I think that's the experience that's possibly the hardest for me to understand and to explain without a paranormal context. Because I'd never seen an image of my grandfather. I'd never, as my dad said, that they were kind of locked away. He was almost forbidden to have them out. My dad didn't have any himself, but I know it was the same fella. So I think that's always kind of given me a belief in the paranormal. But I would need to experience more in order to fully say, yes, I'm a believer. And I think there are things that can be explained away. I think I do think like buildings and places can have imprints of memories and imprints of events that happen there. Like the battlefield in Shrewsbury, within 2 years of the Battle of Shrewsbury,
there was said to be ghosts and apparitions of soldiers wandering the battlefield, big groups of, and I think something like that is more like a memory or an imprint than an actual physical entity. But I think ghost stories are a really good way of seeing attitudes of the time, of events, because I think a ghost comes up when something happens that's very traumatic to a community. A lot of the ghost stories I've dealt with have been really quite horrific murders or really horrible things that have happened to young women. And it's almost like the community cannot believe that that thing has happened, and it's their way of hoping that a little bit of that person still remains. So they interpret the bumps in the night to be that young girl that got murdered, or they interpret, you know, the sounds of the wind as her screams and things like that. And I think it's a very human thing to do, to believe in ghosts and to try and to talk about ghosts. So yes, I do. I probably would say I'm probably like 70-30. I probably do believe there's something going on, but I need a bit more proof.
I think it's something which comes up whenever I kind of think about folklore, or when you discuss folklore, especially with people who aren't necessarily interested in it. You know, they see the world as history, and history is how we came to be, and then we've got modern day, and they're in the modern day, and that's what they care about. Of that question of folklore always comes up of, you know, at what level is it we're feeding it for folklore to exist, or is there something supernatural and someone believes that it's completely supernatural and everything else is interpreted from it? And I always find it greatly interesting, because I'm 100% skeptic in the sense of I don't believe anything, but I know from my experiences of people the power of imagination and collective imagination. And I think, like you say, a community can come together with a collective imagination and create something. Create something which exists in order to deal with trauma, in order to kind of deal with that mention.
Definitely. I think there's a really good example in Ironbridge. Now Ironbridge has got loads of ghosts. There's probably more ghosts than people in the area. But one of the coolest ghosts in the area is this ghost barge that sails down the River Severn directly underneath the Iron Bridge, and it's meant to be kind of being driven by this inhumanly tall, hooded, black cloaked figure who's driving the boat down the River Severn, and it's meant to be piled high with corpses. Apart from that being a really good concept for like a metal album, it's really cool. And then it disappears just past the Iron Bridge, sorry. Right. And then there's an area called Jackfield, which is further down the river. Jackfield in itself, it's got loads of folklore, like the devil's meant to chill out there sometimes. But this ghost barge returns, and it's seen on the riverbank piling the corpses onto the bank, and that's cool in itself. Like, it's just a cool ghost story. But when you know a bit more about the history behind the area, it's even better. So there's, during the 1600s, when the plague hit the however many, like third time or whatever, that whole area of Jackfield was actually a mass grave. And Shropshire hit the plague hit Shropshire, like all the plagues hit Shropshire quite hard, but the one in the 1600s, I think about a third of the population ended up dying. Right. And the main travel route to get the bodies to the plague pit was the River Severn. So there's this idea of this ghost story. Is it an actual physical, ghost story? Is there a ghost? Probably not, but it's the idea of this collective memory, this collective consciousness that goes back to a time when people would have remembered that barge going down the River Severn carrying their loved ones. And it's continued. It's become a entity in itself, that memory. And I think things like that are really cool. I always liked the idea of, because obviously for the general mindset, ghosts are always seen as someone with unfinished business. They stick around, see unfinished business. And I always like to think of it in terms of, it's not necessarily the person who died business, it's the people who knew them, and it's they're not dealing with them passing on, and it's their unfinished business which keeps them alive, makes them a myth and then a legend. So like you said before, where something they don't want to let go. And and I think there's certainly a lot of evidence with the Shropshire ghosts for that kind of thing. There was some stories that would that are horrific anyway, but would be horrific to a small rural community. Like there was one story I read of a young girl getting beaten up, abused, and actually beheaded. And that sort of thing in a modern context would be hard to deal with. But when you're in an isolated small community and you know that, you know, yes, there was people that come and go, but that would be done by somebody in your community that you may have familial ties with, or, you know, go to church with. You don't want to accept that thing's happened, and you don't want to accept that young girl has gone. You want to try and keep a little piece of her away. So I think, you know, that goes back to what you're saying.
Yeah, I think what always gets me interesting with these kinds of things is how there seems to be a drop off for ghosts in terms of modern history and ghosts which exist past World War II.
I would agree. Yeah.
And it's like, you know, I'd love to see some ghosts from the 70s, or hear some ghost stories from, like, you know, some 80s people who were just like, you know, you seen the guy who's like some punk and was in, you know, this nightclub and he goes there every night and dances. And I'm like, I'd love to know that.
Yeah, it would be cool that,
But it makes me question, like, in terms of, obviously, as a society, how we've learned to deal with these things, and whether we've learned to deal with these things better or whether we just ignore it now.
I think we definitely, I think there is almost going back to that idea of, stiff upper lip. If we don't talk about this, or we don't really conceptualize it that much, then it won't, particularly, I think, post World War One, I think there was such an outpouring of collective grief, and that, you know, you didn't want to be grieving for your son publicly because you knew that 7 or 8 people on the street would be grieving in the same way. So you got things like memorials and more memorials, but you weren't going to be seen walking around in black crying and things like that. And I think there is kind of a sweeping under the rug, which has meant there's a die off of ghost stories. Like there are some from like World War One, World War Two kind of time, but I think definitely modern day, I've never heard of like a 2006 Sean Paul-esque ghost yet.
You know, if Sean Paul like ghost can come around and dance, I mean, we all. I mean, I think. What I find interesting, kind of like parallel now, is obviously, you know, we're in a pandemic.
Yeah.
We're in a plague of momentous proportions, which we've never seen in the modern age, and wondering how we as a society will deal with that. Because when I think of like third world countries, which are still dealing with pandemics and still dealing with plagues, they still have a very strong mythos of everybody, and that's how they deal. And that becomes almost part of the religion and part of the things the stories which they tell one another. Whereas in Western society, we abandoned that. Whether that was because we've started to abandon religion on a much larger scale, I don't know.
I think there's been several movements towards, like, I think the abandonment of religion probably did contribute, because a lot of folklore has links to religion. You know, we're not going to a lot of monks.
We're not going
to so many. I read a book once that said that Shropshire didn't have many ghost monks, and I'm like, well, I know at least 12.
Like,
at least 12, and 2 of them are Burley. But so, like, Shropshire has a lot of devil folklore. I have always been interested in the devil folklore because of my connection with my granddad, but I don't view that in the same way that, say, he would. When he was a boy and he was telling that story to other people, that terrified him because he had that Christian worldview and he had that Christian connection. Whereas I've grown up in an era of heavy metal and Tenacious D and, you know, that kind of thing. I don't see the devil as this scary figure. I think it's a fascinating concept. And I think the interplay between humans and this idea of absolute sin is interesting. But I retell these stories from Shropshire as not cautionary tales. I tell them, you know, as, oh, look at this cool story.
Yeah, it's evolved in the reasons we tell it, hasn't it? Like, it's you know, as you say, back in the day, it was don't do this because the devil will come, and don't do this because of this. And whereas now, we're like, entertainment. This will keep me going for 2 hours to watch this documentary about Satan. And
and I think I've noticed through the pandemic, because I moved back to folklore and my interest during the pandemic, and I can see that a lot of people just through social media and stuff are interacting with things like Folklore Thursday and just talking about folklore and making folk horror and that kind of thing just maybe as a result of the pandemic, even things like little cute plague doctor cuddly toys are now everywhere, and everyone wants a plague doctor, and I think it's our way of dealing with it a little bit, maybe.
I think there's something what I'd say is very British about our interest in the morbid, but because we're very standoffish as a nation. I think, as you said earlier, is like we're very stiff upper lip. We don't discuss things. We don't discuss death. We don't discuss other things. But at the same time, we take something extremely morbid and then we go, okay, well, we could make this entertaining.
Yeah.
And we can make this something which will keep me comfortable.
I will. Yeah, I think we do. I think even that links to our fascination with serial killers, and the Victorian era in general has a lot to blame for stuff. And I think that idea of the penny dreadful and the Jack the Ripper and everything, we are fascinated by it, and it's always that curious kind of, what would it be like to completely just let go? And we don't want to, because we like our cups of tea and our our comforts, and we're not talking about our feelings. But the darker side of life fascinates us. Death fascinates us. Murderers, serial killers, the devil, anything that's a bit you wouldn't talk about in polite company is fascinating. And that's why people turn to Slayer and heavy metal and goth culture and stuff, is because it's a way of indulging that curiosity without going completely nuts and trying to be Jack the Ripper.
I think as well, like kind of they used to say, when it comes to especially Satanism and involvement in music and involvement in television, when you do get into it, I mean, from my personal point of view, there was always that level of, this is forbidden.
Yeah.
It's forbidden. I don't necessarily believe in it, but I know other people are afraid of it.
Yeah.
So if I can touch it, then it means that I've gone further than they have ever gone, and I've survived. And it's that level of escapism. Well, yeah, I'm doing something dark, but it's not really dark, because we know it's just music, and we're kind of pushed along the lines. But at the same time, the people who hate me and the people who think that I'm different, they would never go down this road. It gives you that level of status, doesn't it? And I think especially with things like Satanism and witchcraft, the occult, the people that are genuinely practices, and I take my hat off to them. And then there's people like me that have dabbled and been like, oh yeah, look at me, I'm so cool, like being 15 in a goth shop with like a Slayer t-shirt on, like I'm the coolest. And it's like, in reality, no, stop it. Everybody's bought the white magic book and lit a few candles and be like, I could really get into Wiccanism. Like,
look at me.
And then about halfway through, you think, this kind of feels ridiculous.
It's time consuming. Why am I wearing a bed sheet?
It's a lot of time to spend. Like, this is the thing, I would never look down on anyone who does get into rituals or anything like that, because the level of discipline it requires to do it. Like, I don't have that attention span.
No, this is not happening.
It's in a way, it's I do like the round circle of it, of folklore being, like, obviously it was formed or invented in a way to kind of deal with things, whether those things are real or not, is, as you say, it doesn't really matter. It was a way to deal with things. And now there's been a resurgence, like you said, there's been a resurgence of people interested in paranormal and things which can't be explained, almost because there's a level in comfort, because we have so much information right now.
So it is, I think, particularly with the move to folk horror and the rural and the folklore of the rural, it's almost a form of escapism, because we are looking at things that are horrible, like there's a folk tale in Shropshire about the devil, and there's a road called it's called the Devil's Highway. It's near Cardington, and the devil's said to be there in his full devilish form with big horns and hooves and whatnot. And if he likes you and thinks you're a good person, he will let you pass, but he'll give you a bit of a scare. But if he doesn't like you, or he thinks that you're a bad person, he'll skin you alive and beat you to a pulp. And stories like that, we almost get a level of, that's how quaint and that's really cool, but that's a horrific thing to be getting excited about. But we still tell these stories. And I think the rural and rural areas still hold a level of mystique to a lot of people, particularly if you've not grown up in that kind of, it's almost, to me, it's almost like you've got the two contrasting images of the countryside. You've got the pastoral and the folk horror, and they both exist in unison, but people tend to sway more and even things like Escape to the Country. It's, you know, nobody's going to Summer Island and wearing the animal masks, but there's this fascination with the rural society, and I think that's driven a lot of interest in folklore.
Yeah, I think I always say that, like, the picturesque view of rural society and country life and country people, I always find very threatening. Yeah. I find that way more threatening than a group of thugs in a town or a city.
Yeah, I would agree. I actually used to work. I've worked a lot in homeless shelters and with young homelessness, and give me a bunch of tracksuited young lads any day over some of the people you would see in the countryside. I mean, there's a saying in Shropshire that Shropshire people are Shropshire born, Shropshire bred, strong in the arm and thick in the head. So it's like, well, that just means that they've got nothing to tell them that it's not okay to beat someone up or something. I think you could do a whole folk horror thing in itself about that just saying. Yeah.
There's almost something, I think maybe it's because when you meet people from towns and cities, there's a level of you wear everything on your sleeve. You know?
Yeah.
You go, yeah, this is my house. I live on this street, and this is what I do for a living. Whereas when you get onto the countryside, there's a veil. And you're like, I don't know what you keep in your land. You have a lot of land.
Yeah. What's going on? Especially with things like my auntie's got quite a bit of land, and she was into shooting and countryside blood sports, basically. Yeah. But sometimes you'd go to a house and there'd be loads of whatever they'd shot hanging from trees. Mm-hmm. And obviously that is to sort out the meat and that kind of thing. But as a child, if you're walking into like a land and there's a tree full of corpses, it's a bit kind of, don't you dare come here kind of thing. And there's a lot of very brutal things in the countryside. It's a very hard way of life, particularly in the past. And I think that's probably why a lot of folklore is linked to the devil, and because you can't explain why your child died in winter, but if the devil took him or some evil spirit took him, it makes more sense than, you know, life's just cruel. And I think a lot of folklore does come from the idea that trying to understand the cruelty of the world around us.
Yeah, what was kind of occurring to me as we were discussing this is that this idea that as a society and as human beings, we need things like folklore are almost a necessary thing.
Yeah, I would say so. And I think even when we move out of folklore and you look at things like urban legends and even things like Bigfoot in other countries and cryptids and stuff, we need something to focus our energy on and our attention on. And I think it inspires like fantasy and fantasy literature and like that kind of thing, but we almost need something that's a bit odd to kind of go, right, okay, well. And I think I've found that a lot of people have maybe one thing that is their focus. So like cryptids might be somebody's focus, or UFOs. I don't know much about UFOs. It's never something I've looked into, but some people will be convinced that they exist and that's a thing. But then other people will be convinced that like Bigfoot's a thing, and then you've got people convinced that there's a ghost. And I think it's a very human thing to look to the unexplained and try and give it a face.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking back to what you're saying about the idea of urban legends and this resurgence we've seen in the interest of folklore. When I think 20 years ago, back to like the millennium. Oh God, that was 20 years ago. So yeah, when you think like 21 years ago or so, when it was by the millennium and things were kind of, I don't really remember folklore being hugely mentioned back then. It wasn't a really thing. But I remember urban legends being huge back then.
Yeah, even things like creepypastas and stuff. I remember they being a big thing when I was in my teens, and
it was all like
Slender Man.
It was all like tech orientated.
Yeah,
and it was the fears of what the internet could hold, and it was machines turning against us. And X-Files obviously was the thing to watch because no one knew what the internet, Lawnmower Man, and downloading yourself and all the great technology which came out of it. And I think in the past 20 years, obviously, as we've seen, we've undergone a massive change in the amount of information we've got, but our comfort level with that level of information has changed as well.
Yeah.
And to the point where we're no longer that afraid of it because we use it every single day. So we've then reverted back to folklore because we couldn't explain it. And that's something to tell a story about.
Yeah, and they are good stories. I think even if you take away everything, some of them are just bloody good stories, and some of them provide an awful lot of entertainment, and some of them really tap into the fantasy element. And if you've got an interest in fantasy, in like giants and dwarves and goblins and demons and that kind of thing, you're naturally going to look at folklore and go, oh no, that's quite cool. And but I definitely think it forms a level of comfort. And I think because we haven't looked at it for so long, it's almost an untapped source as well. And I've found that particularly with Shropshire, there are certain folklores that we hear a lot about. So we hear a lot about things like selkies and mermaids and dragons in Wales and that kind of thing, but you don't necessarily hear about other things. So even giant folklore, I've found the folklore of giants isn't that represented. There's things in Cornwall, but one of the biggest things in Shropshire is the fact that the Wrekin was supposedly put there by an angry Welsh giant that didn't really like Shrewsbury that much. And I think that links to when you're in that area, the area around the Wrekin, it's the biggest thing you can see. Yeah. So back in the day when, it would be understandable that the biggest thing you could see would be put there by, say, a giant or something. And I do think that there's been an interest not just in folklore like fairies and stuff, but the underrepresented stuff, like as if we're searching a little bit for these new old stories.
Yeah, we're on constant strive for content.
yeah, which would link to kind of the internet, because with things like TikTok and Facebook and things, there's a constant stream of content. Whether or not it's valuable content is another thing, but there's a constant stream of that content. So we are constantly now searching for things that we've not heard before or seen before.
I'm fascinated. We're always fascinated when we find something which isn't online.
Yeah.
When,
yeah.
You read a book and you're like, oh, I've read this story, and like quick Google about it. And you're like, I can't find anything about this.
Yeah, where's this come from?
That doesn't happen.
Yeah. Why Google? Yeah.
I remember fairly recently I found a book and I tried to look up the author of the book, and there was nothing about the author. I was like, I don't know what to do with this information.
Yeah. What do I do?
Is it my responsibility to now put this online?
Yeah, I found that with some of the stuff. I always quite like it when I've put like a folk tale online, or I've written about something and someone goes, oh, I haven't heard of this one. And particularly if they're in Shropshire, I'm like, haha, I am now the king of Shropshire. I know all the facts. Just call me the fact wizard.
Ultimately become the archivist of Shropshire, just by nature of researching things.
Yeah.
I think, it is a fascinating hole to dive into in folklore and why we do. And I think the only real like outstanding question around it is always along the idea of, when you tell folklore and you tell mythos, and there is a story to tell, and there's usually a lesson in some capacity, and they're usually very dark. And you don't tend to get stories with a happy ending.
No, I couldn't really think of many. There's a few that, like the Wrekin giant, for instance. It's the story of this Welsh giant, and he hates Shrewsbury, he hates Shropshire, absolutely hates it. But he has a pact with the mayor of Shrewsbury, and the mayor of Shrewsbury sends him an influx of young girls, doesn't ask any real questions about what the giant's going to be doing with them, and the giant doesn't crush the town to death. And that goes on for a while, until this one girl decides that when she finds out she's going to be a sacrificial lamb, she takes some special herbs with her and actually poisons the giant, sends him into a deep, deep slumber, and gives him a bit of an headache afterwards. She sees all the skulls of these young girls that he's eaten strewn all over the cave, runs back to Shrewsbury, gives the mayor an ear bashing about sacrificing young women, which she probably shouldn't do, and tells him that he's a cannibal. So it all transpires that the giant wakes up as a sore head, finds out that he's been rattled and he's not going to get any more tasty young women anymore. And he marches to Shrewsbury and decides he's going to flatten the place. So he gets his big giant shovel, puts this big mound of earth on the shovel, and is walking. And he happens to meet an old cobbler who's walking with a big pile of shoes on his back, big bag of shoes, sorry. And the cobbler outwits him and tells him that basically Shrewsbury's miles away and he'll never get there. And he says to the giant, he says, well, you know, I'm an old man now with a big white beard and look at my wrinkles. When I was young, I set out on this journey and all of these shoes actually fit my feet, and they were all brand new. Now I've worn them all to the end, and you're on the same journey, pal, basically. And then the giant gets really angry, stomps off, chucks his shovel, crushes a village, you know, in the meantime, but creates the Wrekin, and then stomps off back to Wales, never to be seen again. And it's like, that's not a happy ending. It's not a happy ending for the village that get crushed. It's not a happy ending for all the young girls that got eaten, but it's like a power of wits kind of thing. So I think that's the closest I can think of that you can get to kind of a happy ending in folklore.
I think there's definitely a genre of folklore which is along the lines of, you know, using your intelligence or defeating something which is almost undefeatable, but using just like a trick or something like that.
Sneaky little trick.
And that's about as positive as you can
as you're gonna get. You know, other than that, it's kind of universally a bit grim.
We're naturally just morbid people hunting down the most, you know, because it's not happening to us. I guess it's the way we're looking at it, like, you know, these people are dying. It doesn't matter though. No. We're still here. You know?
Look.
We're surviving. I think it's definitely an interesting topic to kind of dive into. And I think, like you say, there's always new tales to find. Oh
yeah, definitely. And there's also new tales to reinterpret as well. Because like I said, I'm not in I'm put my hat out to people that do study folklore and that do make an academic kind of world of folklore and are in the academic world of folklore. But though I've got a degree, I don't see myself as an academic. I see myself as someone just telling good stories. And I think there's always stories to tell, and I think there's always stories to reinterpret. I'm not overly bothered about finding the truest form of a tale and, you know, recounting it exactly as it was recounted in the 1800s. I want to put my own spin on it. I want to put my own kind of slant on it, and I want to interpret it and see how it feels for me and what it means to me. And I think that's a true form of folklore, and I think that's how, say, my granddad or my great granddad or my family would have seen these tales. Because, you know, I know for a fact that the stories I've told were ones that people in my family, say 200 years ago, 100 years ago, would have known, but would they have recognized the way I tell it? Probably not. And it constantly evolves. Like every generation adds a new layer to these things. Every generation adds a new slant to it. And I think it's nice to be part of that puzzle and part of that tradition.
Encourages that tradition continuance and connection back to the people. I think that's really important. I think that's a great point to round this out on. It's been lovely to have you. Thank you. Where can people find your work in?
So I'm on Twitter as Goblin Egg, but the O is a little zero, because you know, goblins are cool. And my blog is NearlyKnowledgable History at blogspot.com. But it's fine. You can see it on my Twitter as well.
I'll link it all up in the description.
Thank you.
Well, just so people know. But no, it's been lovely to catch up with you and learn all about the monks.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for coming on, and we'll talk to these guys later.
Yeah.